American Life in the Roaring Twenties. Chapter Introduction. America's present need is not heroics but healing, not nostrums but normalcy, not revolution but restoration, not surgery but serenity. Bloodied by the war and disillusioned by the peace, Americans turned inward in the 1920s, shunning diplomatic commitments to foreign countries. They also denounced radical foreign ideas, condemned un American lifestyles, and clanged shut the immigration gates against foreign peoples. They partly sealed off the domestic economy from the rest of the world and plunged headlong into a dizzying decade of homegrown prosperity. The bloom of the Golden Twenties showered genuine benefits on Americans as incomes and living standards rose for many. But there seemed to be something incredible about it all, even as people sang, "My sister, she works in the laundry. My father sells bootlegger gin. My mother, she takes in the washing. My God, how the money rolls in." New technologies, new consumer products, and new forms of leisure and entertainment made the 20s roar. Yet, just beneath the surface lurked widespread anxieties about the future and fears that America was losing sight of its traditional ways. So, life in the Roaring Twenties, just looking at this introduction, standard of living has gone up. However, there were a lot of anxieties that existed, such as anything that was considered radical, or as well as a form of un American lifestyle, which goes ahead and answers, of course, what was life like in the 1920s. Here, you need to understand in the next section what was a Red Scare, as well as the Bolshevik Revolution. So, whole next section focuses on the Red Scare. 30.1 Seeing Red. Historical fears of Red Russia continued to color American thinking for several years after the communists came to power in the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, which spawned the tiny Communist Party in America. Tensions were heightened by the epidemic strikes that convulsed the Republic at war's end, many of the result of high prices and frustrated union organizing drives. Upstanding Americans jumped to the conclusion that labor troubles were fomented by a bomb and whisker Bolsheviks. A general strike in Seattle in 1919, though modest in its demands and orderly in its methods, prompted a call from the mayor for federal troops to head off the anarchy of Russia. Fire and brimstone, evangelist Billy Sunday struck a response chord when he described Bolshevik as a guy with a face like a porcupine and breath that could scare a polecat. If I had my way, I'd fill the jails with so full of them, their feet would stick out the window. The Bolshevik Revolution in this paragraph, what you want to understand, it was a revolution in Russia, of course, that would overthrow the government. It was a communist revolution in Russia, and that was the reason why they dropped out of World War One. So what you want to understand in this first paragraph is that there was a general strike in 1919 in Seattle, and this was kind of bringing fears of communism as well as the Bolshevik Party. Next paragraph. The Big Red Scare of 1919 and 1920 resulted in a nationwide crusade against left-wingers, whose Americanism was suspect. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, who saw red too easily, earned the title of fighting Quaker by his excess of zeal rounding up suspects. They ultimately totaled about 6,000. This drive to root out radicals was redoubled in June 1919 when a bomb shattered both the nerves and the Washington home of Palmer. The Fighting Quaker was thereupon dubbed the Quaking Fighter. Sorry. So two terms that you want to make sure you understand is a Red Scare. Of course, this is an intense anti-communism era, right? We're talking about here, of course, A. Mitchell Palmer, who was setting up the Palmer raids, who was trying to go ahead and round up and arrest anyone that they suspect of course, of being a communist, right? So know who A. Mitchell Palmer was, Attorney General, and know what the Palmer raids were, right? Seeking anyone that was communism because they were seen as a threat. Other events highlighted the Red Scare. Late in December 1919, a shipload of 249 alleged alien radicals was deported on the Buford to the workers' paradise of Russia. One Zelo cried, "My motto for the Reds is SOS, ship or shoot." Hysteria was temporarily revived in September 1920 when a still unexplained bomb blast on Wall Street killed 38 people and wounded more than 100 others. Various states joined the pack against outcry. Various states joined the pack and the outcry against radicals. In 1919 and 1920, a number of legislators, reflecting anxiety of solid citizens, passed criminal syndicalism laws. These anti-red statutes, some of were born of the war, made lawful the mere advocate of violence to secure social change. Advocacy of violence, secure social change. Critics protested that mere words were not criminal deeds, that there was a great gulf between throwing fits and throwing bombs, and that free speech was for the nasty as well as the nice. Violence was done to the traditional American concepts of free speech, as IWW members and other radicals were vigorously prosecuted. The hysteria went so far that in 1925, members of the New York legislature, all lawfully elected, were denied their seats simply because they were socialists. So the criminal syndicalism laws passed by many states during the Red Scare. So what these did was they advocated violence to secure social change. So, in other words, if you were speaking up for social change and you seem like as if you were advocating for socialism or communism, then you might be arrested for it. So, just to kind of take a step back, there were some people that felt that that there was fighting words that might be seen as that would be seen as violent. The Red Scare was a godsend to conservative business people who used to break the backs of fledgling unions. Labor's call for the close or all union shop was denounced as Sovietism in disguise. Employers, in turn, hailed their own anti union campaign for the open up shop as the American plan. So, what you want to understand here, what this American plan was, it was a move away from unions, right? So, you're getting a lot of businesses that they were insisting an open shop, right? Contrast to the mandatory union membership that was seen as closed shop. So, in other words, what they want to see is rather than going on strike or rather than joining a union, that you're getting more communication with workers from businesses to increase benefits like pensions and insurance. But all in all, what you want to understand here is due to the Red Scare, unions were losing some of their power. Anti-Redism and anti-foreignism were reflected in a notorious case regarded by liberals as judicial lynching. Nicola Seiko, a shoe factory owner, and Bartholomew Vanzetti, a fish peddler, were convicted in 1921 of the murder of a Massachusetts paymaster and his guard. The jury and judge were prejudiced to some degree against the defendants because they were Italians, atheists, and anarchists, and draft dodgers. Liberals and radicals, the world over rallied to the defense of the two aliens doomed to die. The case dragged on for 6 years until 1927, when the condemned men were electrocuted. Communists and other radicals were thus presented with two martyrs in the class struggle. While many Americans liberals hung their heads, the evidence against the accused, though damaging, betrayed serious weaknesses. If the trial had been held in an atmosphere less charged with anti-Redism, the outcome might well have been only a prison term. So what you're getting here is you're getting two individuals that were, of course, that they were Italians, but they were also being judged as atheists, anarchists, as well as a draft dodger, and they ended up being persecuted or electrocuted as a result of what would happen in the crime that they were convicted with. So what your textbook is kind of arguing here is that due to the time of the Red Scare, you were seeing a lot more anxiety where punishments were definitely a lot more extreme than they would have been for people that were accused of either being anarchist, socialist, or supporters of communism, as well as atheists. So you can see we definitely did answer all of these questions right here. So you want to make sure you go back and look through it. All in all, what you understand is that the Bolshevik Revolution, which was a communist revolution in the Soviet Union, would lead to a fear that communism was going to spread into the United States. And that's what meant this term, of course, the Red Scare. So go back, look through your text, and be able to use some of these terms as supporting evidence of the Red Scare, the fear of the spread of communism. You could use criminal syndicalism laws, which of course said that violence was not a way for social change, but in some cases, speaking up for socialism and communism was seen as violence. The American plan, which tended to go against unions in favor more of an open shop communication between the business and worker, because remember, unions were seen as something that was maybe leaning too far left. The Palmer raids, of course, which was looking at trying to execute people and persecute people, that were seen as communist. So go back and take a look at that section. Hooded Hoodlums of the KKK. A new Ku Klux Klan spawned by the post-war reaction mushroomed fearsomely in the 1920s. Despite the familiar sheets and hoods, it more closely resembled the anti-foreign nativist movements in the 1850s than the anti-black Night Riders in the 1860s. It was anti-foreign, anti-Catholic, anti-black, anti-Jewish, anti-pacifist, anti-communist, anti-internationalist, anti-evolutionist, anti-bootlegger, anti-gambling, anti-adultery, and anti-birth control. It was also pro-Anglo-Saxon, pro-Native American, pro-Protestant. In short, the Bushido Klan betokened an extremist, ultra-conservative uprisings against many of the forces of diversity and modernity that were transforming American culture. So all in all, I mean, you want to see is that the KKK is kind of changing an identity here. It was anti many things. More specifically, I guess you want to understand, it was more nativist and more conservative, uh, and it was against anything that was changing American culture. As reconstituted, the Klan spread with astonishing rapidity, especially among some of white Protestants in the Midwest and South. At its peak in the mid 1920s, it claimed about 5 million dues paying members and wielded potent political influence. It capitalized on the typical American love of on the edge adventure and in group camaraderie. To say nothing of the adolescent ardor for secret ritual, the Knights of the Invisible Empire included among their officials Imperial Wizards, Grand Goblins, King Kleagles, and other horrendous creatures. The most imperative displays were the conclaves and huge flag waving parades. The chief warning was Blazing Cross. The principal weapon was a bloody lash, supplemented by tars and feathers. Rallying songs were The Fury Cross on High, 100% American, the Ku Klux Klan, and the Pope. One brutal slogan was Kill the Kikes, Coons, and Catholics. The region of hooded terror, so repulsive to the best American ideals, collapsed rather suddenly in the 1920s. Decent people, at last, recoiled from the orgy of ribbon flesh and terrorism, while scandalous embezzling by Klan officials launched a congressional investigation. The bubble was punctured when the movement was exposed as a vicious racket based on a $10 initiation fee, $4 of which was kicked back to local organizers as an incentive to recruit. The KKK was an alarming manifestation of intolerance and prejudice, plaguing people anxious about the dizzying pace of social change in the 1920s. Despite the Klan's decline, civil rights activists fought in vain for legislation making lynching a federal crime, as lawmakers feared alienating white Southerners. So you want to go back and take a look. What groups were the KKK against? I definitely listed those all in the beginning, right? You understand they were no longer just against African Americans; they were also against Catholics and other groups. Where was the new KKK the strongest? I mean, they were definitely strongest in terms of maintaining the American nativist identity. What actions did the KKK take? You go back in that second paragraph and look at just some of the rituals as well as formalities that they had. The Klan would, of course, eventually lose some of the membership because of embezzlement of money and because of the kickbacks. So remember, they were charging a $10 fee, but $4 of it was going back to some of the organizers. Stemming the foreign blood. Isolationist America in the 1920s, ingrown and provisional, had little use for immigrants who began to flood into the country as peace settled suddenly in the war-torn world. Some 800,000 stepped ashore in 1920 and 1921, but two-thirds of them from southern and eastern Europe. The 100% Americans, recoiling at the sight of this resumed new immigration, once cried that famed poem at the base of the Statue of Liberty was all too literally true. They claimed that sickly Europe was indeed vomiting on America, the wretched refuse of its teeming shore. So what this is saying, of course, is you're going to go ahead and experience some of this in this section. You're going to see some of the same issues that individuals of new immigration were dealing with. Congress temporarily plugged the breach with the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. Newcomers from Europe were restricted in any given year to a definite quota, which is set at 3% of the people of their nationality who had been living in the United States in 1910. The national origin system was relatively favorable to the immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, for by 1910, immense numbers of them had already arrived. So what you understand is during this time in the 1920s, there's limitations that are being put into immigrants. This stopgap legislation in 1921 was replaced by the Immigration Act of 1924. So this act is very important. It's also known as the National Origins Act. This act established the quotas for immigration. Immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe was sharply curtailed, while immigrants from Asia were shut out altogether. Right, so limitation of Southern and Eastern Europe, but immigrations from Asia were completely cut out. Quotas for foreigners were cut from 3% to 2%. Because remember, prior to this, what they would do is they would look at the total amount of immigrants that they had, the total population. So, for example, if you had, let's say, 1 million Italians, then for that year they were allowed 3% of that. By 1824, it was lower from 3 to 2% of that were allowed as immigrants. The national origins base was shifted from the census of 1910 to that of 1890, by which comparatively few Southern Europeans arrived. Great Britain and Northern Ireland, for example, could send 65,000 a year against 5,802 for Italy. And that's because there's more British and Northern Ireland individuals than there are Italians. Some Europeans bitterly denounced the device as unfair and discriminatory, a triumph for the nativist belief that the blue-eyed, fair-haired, and Northern Europeans were of better blood. The purpose was clearly to freeze America's existing racial composition, which was largely Northern European. A flagrantly discriminatory section of the Immigration of 1924 slammed the door absolutely against Japanese immigrants. Mass hate American rallies erupted in Japan, and one Japanese super patriot expressed his outrage by committing suicide near the American embassy in Tokyo. Exempt from the quota system were Canadians and Latin Americans, whose proximity made them easy to attract for jobs when times were good, just as easy to send back home when they were not. So you want to understand, of course, this Immigration Act 1924. It was seen to look at favoring those that were more Northern European, right? So Southern and Eastern Europeans were completely angry with this, but Asians were definitely upset about this, especially the Japanese. So one thing I want you to pay attention to is, remember, we also had the 1907 Gentleman's Act, which said that Japanese Americans should not be segregated from other Americans. However, Japan went ahead and agreed to lower the immigration of Japanese into America. But this angers the Japanese government specifically because it's putting them lower on a totem pole because they're not allowed into America at all. The quota system affected a pivotal departure in its American policy. It claimed the nation was filling up, that a no vacancy sign was needed. Immigration henceforth dwindled to a mere trickle. By 1931, probably for the first time in American experience, more foreigners left than arrived. Quotas thus caused America to sacrifice something of its tradition of new freedom and opportunity, as well as the future of its ethnic diversity. The Immigration Act 1924 marked the end of an era, a period of virtually unrestricted immigration that in the preceding century had brought some 35 million newcomers to the United States, mostly from Europe. The immigrant tie was now cut off, but left on American shores by the 1920s, a patchwork of ethnic communities separated from each other from a larger society by language, religion, and customs. Many of the most recent arrivals, including the Italian, Jews, and Poles, lived in isolated ethnic conclaves of their own house of worship, newspapers, and theaters. Efforts to organize labor unions repeatedly foundered on the rock of ethnic differences. Immigrant workers on the same floor might share a common interest in wages and working conditions, but they often had no common language. Indeed, cynical employees often played upon ethnic rivalries to keep their workers divided and powerless. Ethnic variety thus undermined class and political solidarity. It was an old American story, but one that some reformers hoped would not go on forever. Immigration restriction did not appeal to all reformers. Particularly opposed was a chorus of cultural pluralists who had long criticized the idea that American melting pot would eliminate ethnic differences. Two intellectuals, the philosopher Horace Kalin, and the critic Randolph Bourne championed alternative conceptions of the immigrant role in society. At a time when war hysteria demanded the 100% Americanization of German and Austrian immigrants, Kalin defended newcomers' right to practice their own ancestral customs. In Kalin's vision, the United States should provide a protective canopy for ethnic and racial groups to preserve their cultural uniqueness. Like instruments in a symphony orchestra, each immigrant community would harmonize with the others while retaining its own singular identity. So you're looking at these two individuals, Horace Kallen and Randolph Bourne. What they're looking to say is that rather than necessarily assimilating, that immigrants should maintain their cultural identity, right? Um, and it says here, along with Randolph Bourne, early 20th commentators who wrote against the grain of 100% Americanism. So they're celebrating ethnic diversity, right? If Callan stressed the preservation identity, Bourne advocated greater cross-fertilization among immigrants. Cosmopolitan interchange, Bourne believed, was destined to make America not a nationality, but a transnationality, a weaving back and forth with the other lands and many threads of all sizes and colors. In this view, the United States should serve as a vanguard of a more international, multicultural age. So Bourne is kind of saying that the new American should be one that's considered multicultural, the blending of cultures. Callan's pluralism and Bourne's cosmopolitanism attracted a handful of other intellectuals to defense of ethnic diversity, including progressives like John Dewey, Jane Addams, Louis Brandeis, vastly outnumbered in the debate over immigration restriction in the 1920s. These early proponents of cultural pluralism planted the seeds for the blooming multiculturalism in the later quarter of the 20th century. So these views were rare. Everyone was kind of shooting for the Americanism, nativist point of view. So we definitely did go through all these. White Americans want to stop American immigration. Of course, you have this idea of nativism that continues to exist. What were the provisions of the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and Immigration Act of 1924? You want to know the difference between a 2% and 3% rule. Of course, Immigration Act of 1924 lowers that it's 2% of that population from that certain geographic would be allowed. Area would be allowed. So, for example, if you had, like I said, 2% of the amount of Italians that you have in America would be allowed to enter in 1924 versus 2% of, let's say, hypothetically, 3 million, 4 million British citizens that might be at that time. So it tend to favor certain groups. Also, there was a stop to Asian immigration completely. So you want to understand too cultural pluralism. Of course, there's the embracing of the different cultures in America, that they should be able to practice their own culture, but as well as blend, as you could see through the views of Randolph Bourne and also Horace Kalin, right? That they both supported the idea of multiculturalism. So go back and understand that, as look at those details. The Prohibition experiment. One of the last peculiar spasms of the progressive reform movement was Prohibition, loudly supported by crusading churches by many women. The Era New Order was authorized in 1919 by the 18th Amendment, which, of course, makes it illegal for the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages, as implemented by the Volstead Act, passed by Congress later that year. And, of course, the Volstead Act, a federal act enforcing the 18th Amendment, which prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol beverages. Together, these laws made the world safe for hypocrisy. The legal abolition of alcohol was especially popular in the South and the West. Southern whites were eager to keep stimulants out of the hands of blacks, lest they burst out of their place. In the West, Prohibition represented an attack on all the vices associated with the ubiquitous Western saloon: public drunkenness, prostitution, corruption, and crime. But despite the overwhelmingly ratification of the Dry Amendment, strong opposition persisted in larger eastern cities. For many, the wet foreign-born people, old world styles of sociability were built around drinking in beer gardens and corner taverns, Yet, most Americans now assume that prohibition had come to stay. Everywhere, connoisseurs indulge in the last wild things as the nation prepared to enter a permanent alcohol holiday. So, there was a lot of support in the South and the West. Southern whites, of course, wanted to keep alcohol out of the hands of minorities, more specifically African Americans. In the wild, wild West, of course, they wanted to stay away from the public drunkenness, corruption, and crime that often plagued the West. The people that had the most difficult time with this, of course, is the East Coast, more specifically immigrants. But prohibitionists were naive and extreme. They overlooked the tenacious American tradition of strong drink and of weak control by central government, especially over private lives. They forgot that federal authorities had never satisfactorily enforced the law where the majority of people, or a strong minority, were hostile to it. They ignored the fact that one cannot make a crime overnight out of something that millions of people have never regarded as a crime. Lawmakers could not legislate away a thirst. So what the government just could not understand and they didn't really think about was that overnight they were going to make something that was not a crime now a crime. And not everyone felt that this was a moral issue. Peculiar conditions hammered enforcement of prohibition. Profound disillusion over the aftermath of the war raised serious questions as to the wisdom of further self-denial. Slaking thirst became a cherished personal liberty, and many ardent Wets believed that the way to bring out repeal was to violate the law on a larger scale. Hypocritical, hip flask legislators spoke out or vetoed dry while privately drinking wet. Frustrated soldiers returning from France complained that prohibition had been put over on them while they were out over there. Grimy workers bemoaned the loss of their cheap beer while pointing out that the ideal rich could buy all illicit alcohol they wanted. Flaming youth of the Jazz Age thought it was smart to swill bootleg liquor, um, liquid tonsillectomies. Millions of other older citizens likewise found forbidden fruit fascinating as they engaged in bar hunts. So, all in all, what you're getting a lot of people that were upset about that. You're getting veterans that were upset about this. The poor and middle class were upset because, of course, the rich and the wealthy could still find ways to find alcohol, right, through what they called speakeasies. Prohibition might have started off on a better foot if there had been a larger army of encroachment officials. But the state and federal agencies were understaffed, and their snoopers, susceptible to bribery, were underpaid. The public was increasingly distressed as scores of people, including innocent bystanders, were killed by quick trigger dry agents. So there was no way to regulate this. Prohibition simply did not prohibit. The old time men only corner saloons were replaced by thousands of speakeasies with its tiny grilled window through which the thirsty spoke softly before the bar door was open. Hard liquor, especially the cocktail, was drunk in staggering volume by both men and women, largely because of the difficulties of transporting and concealing bottles. Beverages of high alcohol content were popular. Foreign rum runners, often from the West Indies, had their inning in countless cases of liquor leaked down from Canada. The zeal of American prohibition agents on occasion strained diplomatic relations with Uncle Sam's northern neighbor. So this is when you're getting something called the cocktail, which contains hard liquor. Prior to this, most alcohol consumption was beer, but because they had to sneak all of the liquor from Canada, um, it would be smarter to do so in high content of alcohol, right? Um, so at this time, this was also strained a relationship with the United States and Canada. Homebrew and the bathtub gin became popular as law-abiding adults engaged in alky cooking with toy stills. The worst of the homemade rot gut produced blindness, even death. The fabled bootlegger worked in a silent partnership with the friendly undertaker. So people were even trying to homebrew, which sometimes is not necessarily the healthiest thing to do. Yet the noble experiment was not entirely a failure. Bank savings increased, and absenteeism in industry decreased, presumably because the new sober ways of former style barflies. Death rates from alcoholism and cirrhosis declined on a whole. Less alcohol was consumed than in days before Prohibition, but strong drink continued to be available. As legendary Tipler remarked, Prohibition was a darn sight better than no liquor at all. So there were some improvements in life. Of course, bank savings increased because people weren't spending as much on alcohol, as well as morality rates also decreased. So overall, what did the 18th Amendment outlaw? Of course, the 18th Amendment outlawed manufacturing and selling of alcohol. What were the provisions of the Volstead Act? It enforced the 18th Amendment. Where was Prohibition popular and why? Of course, it was very popular in the South because you're getting a lot of the white Southerners that did not want African Americans to drink. Also, very famous in the West because of the Wild Wild West. They want to stop some of those issues that were going on in the saloons, prostitution, corruption. What were some of the problems for enforcing prohibition? Well, it was just tough to enforce it. They didn't have enough government officials to do so, and much of the population already drank alcohol. Results of prohibition, the negatives. Bootlegging would continue, speakeasies, higher alcohol in terms of content, right? The positives, uh, that the mortality rate was definitely lower. Bank savings increased because people weren't spending their money on liquor. Speakeasies were hidden bars. What was the homebrew and bathtub gin? I mean, these were people that were going ahead and trying to create their own alcohol. So, the Golden Age of Gangsters. The Golden Age of Gangsterism. Prohibition spawned shocking crimes. Sorry, that's my dog. The Golden Age of Gangsterism. Prohibition spawned shocking crimes. The lush profits of legal alcohol led to bribery by the police, many who were induced to see and smell no evil. Violent wars broke out in the big cities between rival gangs, often rooted in immigrant neighborhoods, who sought to corner the rich market in booze. Rival triggermen used or saved off shotguns and shattering typewriters, which are also known as machine guns, to erase bootlegging competitors who were trying to muscle in on the racket. In the gang wars of 1920s in Chicago, about 500 mobsters were murdered. Arrests were few and convictions were even fewer, as the button-lipped gangsters covered up for one another with the underworld's code of silence. The rise of Al Capone and gangsterism in Chicago. Al Capone actually owned more than 60% of the Chicago police, so he was able to get away with a lot of the bootlegging. Chicago is by far the most spectacular example of lawlessness. In 1925, Scarface, Al Capone, Chicago gangster, bootlegger, was a grasping and merciless booze distributor, began 6 years of gang warfare that nettled him millions of blood-spattered dollars. He zoomed through the streets in an arm-plated car with bulletproof windows, a Brooklyn newspaper quipped, and the pistol's red glare bombs bursting in air give proof through the night that Chicago is still there. Capone, though branded public enemy number one, could not be convicted on the cold-blooded massacre on St. Valentine's Day in 1929 of 7 disarmed members of a rival gang. But after serving most of an 11-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for income tax evasion, he was released as a syphilitic wreck. So Al Capone, leader of the mob in Chicago, bootlegged Valentine's Day massacre in 1929. Him and his men dressed up as Chicago police officers. They arrested a rival gang, and then what they ended up doing was they revealed themselves as obviously not police officers, and they ended up killing those 7 other gang rivals. Gangsters rapidly played on to profitable and illicit activities, prostitution, gambling, and narcotics. Honest merchants were forced to pay protection money to organized thugs. Otherwise, their widows would be smashed, their trucks overturned, or their employees were themselves beaten up. Racketeers even invaded the ranks of local labor unions and organizers and promoters. Organized crime had to be one of the nation's most gigantic businesses. By 1930, the annual take of the underworld is estimated from 12 billion to 18 billion, several times the incomes of the Washington government. So, gang life was kind of taken over in the 1920s, and a lot of this was a result of prohibition. Because of alcohol was illegal, these gangsters were able to bootleg it in and make their profit. Criminal callousness sank to the new depths in 1932 when the kidnapping for ransom and eventual murder of the infant son of aviator hero Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh, he was an aviator who made history as the first person to fly across the Atlantic. But obviously his son here, looking at this paragraph, was kidnapped by the mob. The entire nation was inexpressibly shocked and saddened, causing Congress in 1939 to pass so-called Lindbergh Law, making interstate abduction in certain circumstances a death penalty offense. So, the Golden Age of Gangsters. What was the relationship between Prohibition and the rise of organized crime? Bootlegging, the selling of alcohol. Who was Al Capone? Mobster, Chicago. Main important nickname was Scarface. When did the St. Valentine's Massacre occur and why? Valentine's Day in Chicago. Um, Al Capone's gang went ahead, dressed up as police officers, and they massacred the rival gang in hopes that they would stop bootlegging. Right. Monkey business in Tennessee.